slightly different questions, so scenario-based and role-play-based, ethics, and then more medicine and society, like how the NHS is dealing right now, as it's really important that as medical students you have a good idea what struggles the NHS is facing at the minute. So we're going to start off with scenario-based or role-play questions. So I've popped some examples up on the screen for you guys as this is recorded just for some practice. As you can see, there's some different scenarios. So the first one, you're playing football in a garden and a ball is kicked over the fence and it breaks your neighbour's garden ornament, which has a sentimental value to them. Explain this, explain how this happened to your neighbour. So I want you to pay attention to who you're speaking to in the scenario that you're given. Are you speaking to someone like a neighbour who you might not have such a close emotional connection to, compared to the one below, where it's you're speaking to a friend and breaking that bad news to a friend? And then the one below that, you are a junior doctor and you're speaking to a more senior colleague. So the first thing I think to be aware of when you're reading the scenario is be aware of who you're playing and who the person that you're speaking to is playing. So I'm just going to move on, if you guys all read those. So yeah, as I said, read the scenario carefully. You're going to speak to a senior colleague differently than you're going to speak to a friend. You're going to assume they have maybe a level of knowledge you wouldn't assume someone who doesn't have a medical background to have. And then same patient, you might want to use simpler language. You're going to want to be more friendly and approachable. And then a friend, I really would say, I know it does sound stupid, treat it like a friend. I had a scenario in my interview, and I was laughing with the actor, which is what you want to get. You want to really treat it like a real scenario. Practice your communication skills. I know it's hard, you guys have been on Zoom for so long, but really maintain good eye contact, pretend the examiner isn't there. Active listening, use your hands, I'm big for that. Nodding, any non-verbal cues you can show real interest and that you're actively in the conversation. Speak slowly and clearly, and make sure to allow the actor time to respond to you, because if you're cutting into them, it's actually giving you less to work off. You want to listen to what they say and then base your response on their response. Keep the conversation flowing. And if you are wanting to interrupt someone, sometimes you might get someone chatty like me, wait until they've taken a breath in. Don't ever interrupt someone mid-sentence. So in a conversation, wait until there's a natural pause. That's something we learned in medical school. So if you already have that skill, you're doing good. I also find it's really helpful to sometimes do a summary mid-conversation. So ask them, kind of say what you've got from this scenario so far. Say, I understand how this has made you feel. I'm so sorry. Can we move forward from this? Try to bring the conversation back to the starting point. And if you feel like you're going off on a tangent, and then change your tone of voice where appropriate. If you're speaking to a child, as I said, you're going to speak differently to a more senior member of staff or something like that. Make sure the level of language you're using is appropriate to the situation. And empathy. So as Callum said, this is one of the skills they're really, really watching out for. So lots of empathetic things. I know how you feel. I'm so sorry about this. You really want to be very apologetic and compassionate, especially if it's a breaking bad news scenario. Some of them are slightly different. It's more of a controversial conversation, which is slightly different. So if you were to catch a senior colleague drinking, it's more of a hard conversation to have, as in you're asking them if they're fit to go into work, compared to breaking bad news to someone you're going to want to be more empathetic to their situation. I recommend to give a warning shot. So good phrases are, I'm afraid I have some bad news to tell you, or I'm in the difficult position of having to tell you this negative thing. Anything to give them an idea that something's bad is coming and they can brace themselves for that. So this, again, I know Callum had a strategy. This is a strategy I use actually in medical school for breaking bad news, which I think is applicable to this scenario. So setting the scene, make sure they're comfortable. Most of the time they're going to be already sitting down in a chair and you don't really need to worry about that side of the thing, but you might look around the room. In one of my interviews we had a box of tissues, so being aware if there's anything they've set up around you that you might want to bring in and use during your interview. And then their perception, see what they already think about the situation, see if they have any prior knowledge of you not being able to come on the holiday with them or their vase already being broken. Then invite them into the conversation. So as I said, you want to give that warning blow. I'm so sorry, I have something negative to tell you. And then give them that information. And normally it's quite good to give it in short, sharp chunks. You don't want to overwhelm them with too much information at one time. So just break it down into small sections and allow them to respond, in between. And then, as I said, empathy, respond to the reaction. Some people might cry, and then you're going to respond much differently to if they're, not quite as bothered. Box of tissues, I think is always good. Offer them a tissue, and try to think of solutions to help them. I was awful at my interviews. I was offering people money left, right, and center because it is a scenario. Offer to buy them that new vase, offer to do something even if it isn't really applicable outside the scenario. So yeah, now we're going to move on to ethics questions. So these are some key ones, and they kind of highlight the areas that you should, if possible, be reading up before your interview. So areas like patient confidentiality, can it ever be broken? Yeah, really important, that can only be broken in very, very more unusual cases, such as like infectious diseases, or if it comes to like a court of law or stuff like that. So really be clued up for that. Should doctors be allowed to strike? That's more of a personal opinion. I think possibly a question that might come up due to the doctors and nurses striking. And then a more scenario-based question. So we have, you're part of a medical skill council deciding upon allocation for a liver transplant. There is one liver but two patients. So this is very common. Maybe not quite this scenario. It could be a heart transplant or something along those lines, but there'll be 2, 3, 4 patients who have different characteristics, which make it hard to choose who is the correct one to give this transplant to. So big ones are drinkers, non-drinkers, parents, not parents, young and old. And these really have no right answer. It's about thinking and then justifying your reasoning. So as long as you can show that you've considered both sides of the argument, so really talk through your thought process, then it's a really good way to approach it. As long as you don't just say patient A, you have to say, I would choose patient A, but I can see why people would choose patient B, but I haven't chosen him because. So kind of really talk through the thought process that you've had to get to your answer. And then we've got kind of more things that you might come across as a junior doctor. So someone that's bleeding is refusing a blood transfusion. Why would they do that? It's putting yourself in the patient's shoes and being able to understand that people have different viewpoints and how to resolve conflict and have hard conversations. So similar to the scenario based. And then a bit more about patient confidentiality, but in a more scenario question. So a patient has an STI and they won't tell their partner. What would you do in this situation? Really putting yourself in a medical student or doctor's shoes. And then what are the 4 ethical pillars? So I don't think it's very likely that they may ask you about them directly, but I think you should bring up the 4 ethical pillars in your answers if possible. So I will go on to talk about them in my next slide. So the 4 pillars of medical ethics are autonomy, non-maleficence, beneficence, and justice. So yeah, as I said, always try to mention them. If not by name, just show you've included them in your thought process to get to your answer. So yeah, really, really important, make a note of those. And don't start with a strong viewpoint one way or another. As I said, it's important not to just jump to a conclusion and stick with it. You need to show you've considered both sides and the journey which you take to get to the answer. And then some key things that I would personally read into if I were you guys is Gillick's competence and the Fraser guidelines. So you don't need to fully understand them, but just an idea about providing providing healthcare to people under the age of 16, especially, or 18, especially when it comes to sexual health and stuff like that. So this quite often comes up. And then the NHS's stand on abortions and euthanasia. Again, it's good to know what the NHS guidelines kind of think about that before you go off telling your personal opinion. And then patient confidentiality, as I mentioned, what are the few scenarios where you can break patient confidentiality? And then finally, so the roles of medicine in society, and then kind of broader NHS questions currently. So some things that are currently happening in the NHS, as I'm sure you guys know, we have an aging population, more and more people are obese nowadays. So these are kind of big things that are currently bothering the NHS, and kind of key thing, you'd want to know why these things are coming about. So I'd recommend, if I were you guys, mentioning things like multimorbidity, polypharmacy, things that are really resulting due to these aging populations and obesity crises. I don't know, just have a look at kind of all these topics in your own time and have a bit of a brief idea that you can structure into an answer. Similarly with antibiotic resistance, kind of what the problem is and what you would do to change the problem. It's good to have like a bit of a proactive approach to answering these questions. Similarly, postcode lottery, is it fair? So a bit of a double question. First, you have to know what the postcode lottery is. So based on geographical areas in the UK, if you get better healthcare or not, and is it fair? Again, it's a bit of a personal opinion, making sure you show both sides of the arguments, but coming to a conclusion. If you had £1 billion to spend on one element of healthcare, what would it be and why? Again, something, it may be a cause close to you, or you could look in the news and research in the NHS and see kind of what areas do need more help, such as mental health, or after COVID, you know, surgeries that have been delayed, stuff like that. Medical publications, I would recommend everyone to have read at least one medical publication recently, because you do not want to lie and say yes and then them ask you lots of follow-up questions and you have no idea. So I have a few under your sleeve that you can say, yeah, I've read about these, I really enjoyed them, I got this from them, it's made me interested in doing medical research. Depending where you've applied to, I personally applied to went to St Andrews, so we had to do a dissertation before we came to Glasgow. So if you're applying to a school like that, really they'll put more weight on reading medical publications. And then what do you consider to be an important advancement in medicine in the last 50, 100 years? Just general knowledge about medicine and, you know, what's needed. A bit more like researchy questions. So yeah, thank you so much for listening, and